A bombshell new lawsuit that involves Sean Diddy Combs, but isn't against the disgraced music mogul. As Diddy is listening to closing arguments in his sex trafficking and racketeering trial in federal court in New York, his son, Justin, has been hit with a lawsuit by a woman who claims that he lured her to Los Angeles to be raped by multiple men, including his dad, Sean Diddy Combs.
Nobody expected it to come from inside the house. That's the part shaking everything right now. Because when critics talk, it's noise. When rivals talk, it's strategy. When outsiders speculate, it's entertainment.
Of this new lawsuit involving the son of Sean Diddy Combs. It was just in the hours after the government on Thursday finished their closing arguments in the case against the disgraced music mogul that we learned about this new lawsuit against Sean Combs' son, Justin. Justin is one of Diddy's 7 kids. Here he is with his dad's arm around his shoulder. Justin has been in court supporting his dad, just as his siblings have been over the past 7 weeks of testimony. Now, listen, whatever your feelings are on Sean Combs and whether you think he's guilty of the charges that could put him in federal prison for the rest of his life, you just have to think how difficult it must be to hear about all the sexual exploits of their father. But if you believe the allegations I'm about to tell you in this new lawsuit brought against Justin Combs, Justin apparently was very aware of his dad's lifestyle. The new lawsuit that just dropped was filed by a woman from Louisiana who says in 2017, Justin Combs coaxed her to come to LA because she says that Diddy's son promised her a job in the entertainment industry. She claims the two had met on Snapchat, and Justin allegedly asked for explicit pictures, and she sent them. The woman, who's not named in this suit, says when she got to LA, she was raped by several men, including a certain music mogul now at the center of this high-profile, historic trial in federal court in Lower Manhattan. Yes, Sean Diddy Combs. The alleged victim claims that Justin invited her out west for a weekend to talk about her career. But when she got there, she says she was kept in a house in Beverly Hills. And according to the lawsuit, things seemed fine at first, but when she allegedly asked Justin Combs if they were going to leave the house, he said no. She claims that Justin Combs offered her alcohol, pills, and weed, and she thinks that the weed was laced. Now, you can see in those allegations some of the comparisons in this lawsuit to the so-called freak-offs that we have been hearing about for weeks at the center of the Sean Diddy Combs sex trafficking and racketeering trial. The woman says after she took the drugs, 3 men entered the house and all of them were wearing masks. Now, it's unclear what kind of masks the men were wearing, but when I read that part, I thought about the testimony of Sheree Hayes in the Sean Diddy Combs trial, the escort known as the Punisher. He testified that during a freak-off, Sean Combs allegedly wore a face covering that he likened to a Muslim hijab. In the lawsuit against Justin Combs, the alleged victim says that she knew that one of the men was Diddy just because of his mannerisms, but how about this? She also knew it was Diddy because she says that Justin, as his dad, entered the home to allegedly rape a woman that he brought to LA, called Diddy, quote, Pops. Now, we see on Justin's social media that Pops is the phrase that he often uses for his dad. In this lawsuit, the alleged victim claims that she was led to a bedroom where she was allegedly told, quote, you better let this happen or else. Then she says that each man took a turn raping her, calling it a, quote, brutal gang rape. After that, she was taken to an airport on Monday and flown home. Not only is Diddy facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted of all the charges in his sex trafficking and racketeering trial, there have been nearly 80 lawsuits filed against him in civil court. Many are still active. Several of the lawsuits accuse Diddy of sexual abuse and are filed by people who are not giving their names, just like in this lawsuit that we're talking about. This also isn't the first lawsuit that Justin Combs has recently faced. Justin was named in a suit brought by music producer Rodney Jones, who goes by Little Rod. Rod claims that Diddy coerced him into sexual acts, and you can see the suit also names Justin Combs and accused Justin of covering up a shooting in 2022 at Little Rod's studio in LA with his dad.
But when someone from within the family structure speaks, that hits differently. And the reason it hits differently is simple: proximity changes credibility. For years, this empire architect built an image of dominance, authority, precision, control, not just over business, but over narrative, over perception, over how the world saw the brand and the bloodline attached to it. Publicly, the family image looked unified, celebratory, loyal, untouchable. smiling photos, carefully curated appearances, statements of admiration and pride. But behind curated images, there are always private realities. And now, fragments of those private realities are surfacing. Not in the form of a press conference, not in a courtroom document, but through subtle disclosures, emotional statements, carefully worded revelations that feel less like exposure and more like emotional release. The daughter figure at the center.
In May, a judge did dismiss Justin from Little Rod's lawsuit, so he is no longer facing those allegations. As for the lawsuit filed in the hours before his dad's attorneys were to make closing arguments, E! News reports that Diddy's attorneys have denied the allegations, but it's unclear what Justin's response is at the time of this recording. Joining us now is criminal defense attorney Will Corman. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us. What stands out to you in this lawsuit that Sean Combs is named, but also his son Justin?
Well, it's interesting. I think the connection to Sean Combs is pretty tenuous. You know, we've gone through this all. It almost seems the one connection to Sean Combs they actually put on him is the allegation that Justin called one of the masked men Pops during the course of the assault or just before the assault. That's it. The other connection, obviously, is that Sean Combs is Justin Combs' dad. So I think it's a bit of a stretch. Again, we're just receiving these documents now. We're just going through this lawsuit now. Perhaps there's more out there, but it really doesn't seem that way.
And of course, people who are victims of sexual violence, you want them to get their justice. We have seen dozens of lawsuits filed against Justin's dad in the wake of when he was indicted for the trial that he's on right now. How do you go through these lawsuits and understand who's telling the truth and who actually has a case that could be heard in court? Someone like Cassie Ventura, when you see that video from 2016, or you do look at some of these Jane Doe lawsuits and you wonder how many of them are true.
Look, as a criminal defense attorney, it's my job to be cynical, and it's my job to, review everything with a pretty jaundiced eye. So the question really becomes are there corroborating facts and circumstances from Jump Street that make sense? So for example, if this lawsuit is alleging that something happened in LA during a specific period of time, do we know that Sean Combs was there? Do we actually know that he was present in LA? These things aren't difficult to find out, but it's those baby steps to trying to build the foundation of a lawsuit to see what's realistic that really matter in a case like this. And as you so correctly said, we want victims of domestic violence, of sexual violence, and so on and so forth to actually be compensated accordingly. Unfortunately, when we have circumstances where we have somebody famous who's been charged with crimes, we have somebody famous who's been sued, there can be instances where other folks jump on the bandwagon. And I'm not suggesting that's what's happening here, but it is something that everyone needs to look at skeptically.
Right, absolutely. If you were to bring a lawsuit against someone like Justin Combs, or any of these, and even the cases involving his dad, and you're bringing a civil suit, what facts do you need to have? I mean, certainly if you have a victim who says that this happened and they're ready to, they're able to provide some corroborating evidence that something happened, what do you actually need to be able to go to the courthouse and say, I'm filing a lawsuit against this person?
I think that you need to have somebody who's willing to state under oath that this is what happened to me, that this is what I'm alleging, these are my damages, this is how it's impacted me. And as an attorney, again, I would want to make sure, especially in a lawsuit like this, where it involves a high-profile person, but quite frankly, in any lawsuit, that there is some corroborating information out there so that my lawsuit isn't tossed out
of this storm didn't scream accusations. She didn't present documents. She didn't host a tell-all spectacle. She spoke about atmosphere, about pressure, about what it feels like growing up inside an empire where vulnerability is weakness and loyalty is demanded, not requested. She described a childhood shaped by public performance, by expectations tied to a surname, by an environment where image mattered more than emotional safety. And that alone cracked something. Because the empire was always presented as aspirational. Luxury. Success. Power. But when someone raised inside that luxury begins hinting at emotional turbulence, control, or imbalance, the narrative fractures. She talked about fear of disappointing the patriarch, about walking on invisible lines, about consequences that weren't physical, but psychological. Control through approval withdrawal. Affection used as leverage. Silence encouraged in the name of family unity. And what makes this more unsettling isn't that she claimed criminal behavior.
Court pretty quickly.
And reading through this complaint, it mentions several other lawsuits. You have the lawsuit from Rodney Jones, who's known as Little Rod, and Sean Combs is facing that lawsuit, and his son was named in it, but has since been dropped. What do you make about it having all these other different cases and elements brought in? What is the attorney here trying to prove?
Well, it almost appears as if the attorney is saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. So here are all these other lawsuits, and I've reviewed the complaint, and they talk about them in some detail. They don't just list them. They say, this happened on this date, and this person sued Sean Combs here, and this person sued Sean Combs here for this set of facts and circumstances. And they're essentially trying to say, because there's all these other lawsuits, you should give this one a stamp of approval, because again, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Tony Busby, his law firm is bringing this. He has been in the civil world a very, very prominent name. For those who don't know him, and you work in criminal defense, what do you know about Tony Busby? Knowing that it's his law firm bringing this, what does that tell you?
I don't think that the Busby law firm is taking these allegations lightly. I believe they have the resources to do their own investigations prior to actually filing these suits. So this isn't some, sole practitioner who's trying to jump on the cottage industry that's been created around suing Sean Combs. I think that they have the ability to investigate this. They have the ability to decide whether or not they want to take on these cases. And I think that does lend some credibility, albeit, not a ton, but I think it does lend some credibility to the facts and circumstances surrounding it. In other words, this alleged victim didn't just walk in off the street to some random law firm who then is saying, oh, we now have the ability to sue Sean Combs. This is someone who's been down this well-trod path before and probably knows exactly what the pitfalls are in suing somebody as prominent as Sean Combs.
This lawsuit came down at the time we're recording this, came down last night. So that was a couple hours after the government finished their closing arguments against Sean Combs. And as we're recording this right now, Sean Combs, his defense team is giving his closing argument. What do you make about the timing of this? It's against Justin Combs and Sean Combs' name, but it's happening right in the middle of maybe the most pivotal part of this entire trial.
I don't exactly know what to make of the timing of it. I think it's interesting. I think that I'm a little surprised that it's come out so late, but sometimes we don't know what led the alleged victim in this lawsuit to break their silence and to file this lawsuit. Perhaps they were watching the testimony or reviewing the testimony in the criminal case and said, oh my gosh, that's exactly what happened to me. Perhaps they said, they listened to the testimony and they said, there are so many victims here. I believe that I am one too. We don't know what prompted it. I think the timing is interesting, but I don't know that I can make anything of it as we sit here right now.
I think of recently you had Tyler Perry, prominent name in Hollywood, very different case, but accused of sexual violence and sexual harassment, workplace harassment with an actor who had worked on one of his shows, and the actor provided text messages in the complaint. This doesn't have that. Very different case. But the fact that there's not that visual evidence that we can look at, and I don't know what type of visual evidence would exist in a case like this, but the fact that we don't.
It's that she described emotional dynamics that feel disturbingly familiar to anyone who's lived inside power-dominant households. The internet responded instantly. Clips spread. Old interviews resurfaced. Moments where the daughter looked uncomfortable in hindsight. Moments that were once interpreted as shyness now being reevaluated through a darker lens. That's how perception shifts. Not because facts change, but because context evolves. Supporters of the Empire architect rushed to defend. They argued that family disagreements shouldn't be weaponized publicly. That success breeds resentment. That growing up in the spotlight distorts memories. But critics countered that emotional truth doesn't require legal evidence. That sometimes the most damaging revelations aren't criminal, they're relational. And relational cracks inside a dynasty are dangerous. Because empires built on dominance rarely handle internal dissent well. Especially when it comes from a child. Because that challenges not just business authority, but parental.
See it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR so that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, you know what, I am a changed person. But also in that same breath, what kind of message do you think that sends to victims out there who may have been abused or, something had happened to them by a high profile figure?
Authority. And those two power roles combined can create complex psychological dynamics. The daughter didn't describe violence. She described control. She didn't describe chaos. She described emotional coldness disguised as discipline. She didn't accuse. She implied. And implication is powerful, because it invites the public to fill in the blanks. Industry insiders are watching closely. Not because this directly threatens contracts, but because public perception of a patriarch's character influences every brand connected to that name. Family image is currency. And if that image cracks, sponsors hesitate. Partnerships reassess. Affiliations distance quietly. The most haunting part of her words was the suggestion that public praise often masked private tension. That moment celebrated on red carpets didn't reflect what happened afterward. That affection sometimes felt performative. And when someone raised inside power begins speaking about emotional isolation,
they want to report this to police. They want to either go to maybe a civil lawyer, all of that stuff. But then after this trial, they are like, no, I can't do that. Look what happened in this case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there are definitely people who are victims advocates and victims themselves who think that this trial serves to kind of throw cold water, if you will, and chill victims who might want to come forward to express what happened to them, to initiate a criminal case, to initiate a civil case. They look at this case and say, at what cost is it to me personally to have to bare my soul to only then be grilled on cross examination, to have all of my intimate details bantied about, in the media, and then to be judged and then go through all of that. And I walk away in some ways empty handed. Now, that's certainly one way of looking at things. And there's a lot of credibility as it relates to understanding how someone could feel that way.
Mhm.
The flip side, because remember, the scales of justice isn't just one side, there's two sides. The
Mhm.
other side, if you will, is at what point in time does a person pay in full their price to society? And then once they've paid the price for their transgressions, at what point do you then look at that person and feel like, hey, you could be a changed person. You can redeem yourself. There's things that you can do to essentially prove to us as members of the public, as clients, as customers, that you know what, you're a changed man. And so that's the hill Diddy has to climb. Whether he climbs that hill or not remains to be seen, but it's definitely a hill that's in front of him. And some might say it's not a hill, it's a mountain.
It is a mountain for Diddy. I think it might honestly be Mount Everest. It's a large mountain for him to scale, for I think people to possibly forget in their conscious what we learned in this trial. And I remember when Sean Combs, we've been covering this since Cassie's lawsuit, since 2023, November of that year. And I just remember thinking that there would be some type of reckoning within the hip hop community, the Black community, as far as Me Too goes, something kind of similar. And I thought, possibly, and I think maybe other people thought so too, that maybe Sean Combs was kind of that person that would, bring about this kind of reckoning in the hip hop community as far as Me Too goes. But do you think that can still happen? Do you think that will still happen?
Well, I think that Diddy's trial, served as a clarion call, a wake up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in
Yeah,
the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen.
Mhm.
Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look, if you really look at the case, and not just the legal case, but the case in the court of public opinion. And victims, if you will, won because he has not only did he have a criminal case he had to deal with, but he has what, upwards of 20, 30 civil cases
I think
that
even
he's
more than
also going to have
that.
to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each one of those cases, even if it's not proved by the victim that it happened, he is still going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees for each and every single case, and maybe millions for the more serious and those that get further down the line. So he's not done paying for his transgressions. And I think that for other people who are in similarly situated positions of power and influence, they certainly took notes from the Diddy trial.
It forces uncomfortable questions about how success impacts family structures. Because power outside the home often demands control inside it. Some fans are empathizing with the daughter. Others are accusing her of betrayal. And that divide is exactly where legacy damage grows. Because if more family members validate her perspective, the narrative escalates from isolated grievance to systemic family dysfunction. But if she stands alone, the machine will attempt to frame her as unstable, manipulated, or confused. That's historically how empires defend against internal rebellion. Discredit the source. Reinforce the brand. Protect the patriarch. Right now, we're in the tension phase. No lawsuits. No official statements. Just emotional testimony colliding with decades of carefully curated public image. And emotional testimony is harder to litigate. You can't sue someone for saying they felt unloved. You can't legally.
A lot of the themes that, again, the prosecution was trying to push forward, that we saw in his personal life with Cassandra Ventura, always needing to be number one, not necessarily regarding the damages he's doing to other people in the prosecution's eyes, right? Playing out in the business sense. So the backstory is that he didn't appreciate the friendship that was forming between Biggie and Tupac, and therefore, that's where his alleged involvement came in. And then when, in terms of the non-payment, I think that was also a really shocking moment as well, because that's something we saw happening over and over in the documentary. Multiple people who were saying, I was cheated out of my share in the company. I wasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And allegedly, that's sort of how he treated the artists that were on his label. So again, it's the theme of always wanting to be number one and, not necessarily giving people their due, business sense or personal sense.
Okay, so with that, I will tell you, I think one of the most shocking allegations comes to Biggie Smalls, okay? You talk about finances, you talk about that, okay. One of the biggest names at Bad Boy, seemingly very close friends with Sean Combs. Well, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs, and again, this is his allegation, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs insisted that Biggie travel to Los Angeles as part of an album tour, and this is despite, the serious dangers that were present from the rivalries, the East Coast, West Coast. And once there, Combs allegedly decided to cancel a trip that Biggie was supposed to take to the UK, instead saying he needed to stay in LA. Combs apparently threw a large party, and after which, someone opened fire on the car that Biggie was riding in, killing him. Now, Burrows alleges that Combs used all of this publicity around Biggie's murder and his massive funeral to just gain his own fame for his own benefit, shooting to the top of the charts with the song Missing You, which featured, by the way, Biggie's widow. But this was one salacious claim that I really wasn't expecting. According to Burrows, Combs, allegedly, charged the costs of that massive funeral to Biggie's estate and had Biggie's recently renegotiated contract changed to make it more favorable for Bad Boy Records and less favorable for Biggie's loved ones after his death. Elizabeth, again, that one I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, it was really unexpected. And again, I think it speaks to the strength of the documentary, just at least creatively and what they were able to get in terms of the interviewees, claims that we hadn't heard before. So the claims were that, he had wanted, in the documentary, the interviews talk about, Diddy had said, we need to put on the biggest funeral New York has ever seen for Biggie. And when apparently, allegedly, when he saw how much it would cost, that's when he had said, we'll be charging this to the estate, allegedly. One of the other things was he had wanted to put out that song about Biggie after he had passed away, and that was really a big moment. He had performed it at the MTV Movie Awards. And then one of the other claims was, Biggie was set to debut on the cover of Rolling Stone, or at least be on the cover of Rolling Stone. And allegedly, one of the interviewees says after he had passed, Sean Combs had called him and said, I'm coming out with my first solo album. I need that cover. So Sean Combs had allegedly taken that cover from Biggie even after he had passed away. And again, it kind of rides to this theme of, in the public, his friend had passed away. He was devastated. But sort of what you see behind the scenes, at least what the documentary is alleging, is all the different ways he's using that to help benefit him financially and in terms of his career, which is something that we hadn't seen before. And, even myself, like I'm sure you empathize, Jesse, as a millennial. We grew up seeing Diddy, knowing the backstory of him and Biggie and sort of knowing that song and thinking, oh, they were close friends. He paid tribute to his friend. That's so moving. And then to hear all of these allegations, it really paints, another picture.
I remember when that happened. It was such a sad time, and to think about them dedicating a song to his close friend, I mean, it hit an emotional core. You looked at Diddy in a totally different light.
Erase someone's childhood memories. You can only counter them with alternative narratives. And that's what's beginning. Allies posting praise. Old family footage being reshared. Stories of generosity and mentorship flooding timelines. Image reinforcement in real time. Because when emotional cracks surface, PR machinery moves fast. The daughter, however, appears calm, measured, not sensational. And that calm delivery makes her words heavier. Because she's not trying to destroy an empire. She's trying to explain her experience. But explanation alone can destabilize power. Especially when power is built on the illusion of perfection. What happens next depends on whether this becomes a one-time emotional release, or the beginning of deeper disclosures. If more details emerge, if siblings echo similar experiences, if former household staff speak, then this evolves. But even if nothing else surfaces, the damage has already begun. Because the public can never unhear what she described. And once the image of a flawless patriarch fractures, it never fully reforms. Empires survive lawsuits. They survive rivalries. They survive business collapse. But surviving internal family exposure? That's different. Because it hits at the root of character. And character determines legacy. Right now, the empire architect is under fire not from critics, but from reflection, from memory, from emotional truth. And whether the world views that truth as betrayal or bravery will shape how this dynasty is remembered moving forward. Because sometimes, the most destabilizing revelations don't come from enemies. They come from blood. And those are the ones that echo the longest.